Hope you've had a great week, and those who went to camp, I hope that you really enjoyed it. And I know that those who did, we had a great speaker this year. He was really terrific. I didn't get to know him as well as I would have liked to have. But anyway, that's how it is, isn't it? But from what I did see, lovely guy. Just a lovely gentleman to talk to, but a great message, really great message. So if you haven't heard his message, they are available online for you to listen to. Just before we rip into it, just like to say thank you to Hetty and Stuart for replacing the windows at the back. You know, it's not a 5-minute job ripping out those windows at the back, was it? It was a couple of days. But we've been sort of chin-wagging over that at the board for the last couple of years, and finally got them done and saved our church many, many thousands of dollars. So we want to say thank you very much for your hard work and for the work out that you got done. So really appreciate that very much. Okay, so today is the Conundrums facing Esther, and I'd like us to look at a few of those this morning. But before we do, I'd like to take you to a place called Hebron, in 30 k's south of Jerusalem, which is in the West Bank and it's in the Palestinian territory. And it's best known for the mosque there, and it's a very sacred site to Muslims there. And it had changed hands a few times over the centuries, particularly in the Middle Ages, when the Crusades came, and it became a basilica, and then it became a mosque in the 12th century, and it's been a mosque pretty much ever since, except for in the 1967 Six-Day War, and they allocated an area for the Jews to pray. And where that gentleman is standing, where the Jews are allowed to come and pray. So you can imagine that this will be a site of contention between Christians, Muslims, as well as Jews, for this very reason, that this is the Ibrahimi Mosque is what it's called, and there is also, underneath there are caves. And in the caves are tombs. And this is the tomb of Sarah, Abraham's wife, and this is the tomb of Isaac there. And so now you can see why this place is becoming quite sacred there. Oh, that's the colour photo version. These very difficult to get into these caves. They're no public access, and so these photos were taken around about 1898. So this one's a coloured version of it. This is the cenotaph of Abraham, and so it was believed that Abraham was buried there. When they first discovered, and they had archaeologists who went down in there, they found bones there, and so the story goes, they believed that these were the bones of Abraham. Now, this, as I said, is a mosque and sacred, people praying there. And unfortunately, on one day, this gentleman here, Baruch Goldstein, on February 25, 1994, stormed in there while they were praying with his rifle, with his automatic weapon, shot 29, wounded around about 120. He was beaten to death after that event. He moved to Israel in 1982. He's a physician, or was a physician, and he thought, you know what I'll do? I'll go and slaughter a whole lot of Muslims. Now you might ask a very good question. Why? Why would he even think about doing that? Well, glad you asked that question. Now before, he was celebrating a festivity called Purim, and which all Jews celebrate, and they've been celebrating it for the last 2,000 years. And this is one of their most joyous celebrations that they have. And you can even see at times in some pictures some very conservative Jews, ultra-Orthodox, who are actually quite happy. And so this is their praise that they have. They celebrate it every year around about in late Feb and about up to about the third week of March. And that's what they do to celebrate it. Why do they celebrate it? Let's turn to Esther. Esther chapter 9. This is why... Esther chapter 9. It's actually quite a gory part in this part of Esther. In Esther chapter 9, if you turn to verse 5, and in verse 5 it says here that the Jews, in verse 5, the Jews struck all the enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. And in Susha, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed, how many? 500. And as they say on TV all too often, that's not all. Verse 14. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susha, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged, and the Jews were in Susha gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed how many? So we're up to how many? All right. And that's not all. Verse 16. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from the enemies and killed how many? So, for over 2,000 years, the Jews have been celebrating Purim, which is to celebrate that. The killing of their enemies and the deliverance of his people out of a situation. Pretty gory, isn't it? And it's a pretty sad end if you sort of look at it in our 21st century eyes of what happened at that time. Now, we're going to have a wee look at Esther, and we don't actually have a lot of time, so we're going to have to breeze through it fairly quickly. But who would like a few trivial questions? So, trivia. So, now, for those who want to whip out their phones, so that means you've got to log off Facebook and log off Amazon.com. And you can log on to this, and we got some questions for you. This is what you call a Mentimeter, not a mental meter, a Mentimeter, and you can enter some answers in there. And I'm going to ask you some questions, and we're going to see how you go, because there's something really fascinating that comes out of this that I hope that you all find interesting. All right, okay. Me being a techno whiz and a techno expert on this, how long does it take to log on, Jason? Yeah, a couple of seconds, so you should be logged on.
Also, you can read the web address at the top. You can join on that code.
All right, so you that's a QR code. Do that on your phone and you should be able to log in. Sorry, you're logged in? Some says it's too far away. Welcome to get out of your seat and get closer if you don't have a magnifying thingy bob on your phone. All right, 27. All right, that's really good. That's impressive. Okay. All right, so here's your first question. All right. Oh, okay. So do you operate it from here, do you?
There we go.
How many visions are there in Esther? All right. Okay, everyone's voted. Next question. All right. Oh, 9 of you got the 0. All right. "33 players ready." Come on, all you theologians. Everyone's voted. All right. Very good. Okay, next one. I've got to sit down for this. Oh, half an hour. All right. And our last question. That's the names of Elohim and Yahweh. So both names. You're starting to get the idea, aren't you? Yeah. Now, does everyone find it strange that prayer in the name of God is not used in Esther? While that's true, but the name of God is mentioned in other books of the Bible, but prayer is not mentioned in Esther. There are no visions. There's no apocalyptic vision in it. And the name of God is not mentioned. Now, let's turn to Esther 4 verses verse 16. It says here, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susha and hold a fast on my behalf and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night, and I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, and though it is against the Jews, and if I perish, I perish." Now, what do you normally do when you fast? You pray. Now, it's like that the author's gone out of its way not to mention prayer. So I wonder why the book of Esther doesn't mention the name of God, no apocalyptic vision, doesn't mention the word prayer in it, or any of these other things that we would normally associate with being a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. There's a very good reason for it, and I'll tell you later. I'll keep you in suspense for a wee bit longer. All right. Let's go to the first couple of chapters in Esther, and we'll just have a wee look at it. Okay. So, you will recall in the first book, in the first chapter, the king holds a feast. All right. So, and we'll need to just sort of breeze through it very, very quickly. Verse 4. "While he showed the riches of the royal glory and the splendour and pomp of his greatness for many days," for 180 days. And so, for 180 days, King Xerxes, who reigned from 483 onwards, and this is the time of when the Jews were supposed to be heading back to Israel. And so Xerxes was holding a feast here, and of course there were some Jews still hanging around Jerusalem, hanging around Babylon. So he was holding a feast here. How long was this feast for? 180 days. To do what? Celebration. And to what? To show what? His glory and his splendour. So what would happen in the great hall, he would not only have wonderful food for 180 days, no Weight Watchers then, and then all that time he would be showing his glories. More camels, more horses, more jewellery. Would you be bored after the fourth day? Imagine 180. Oh. But that's how rich he was. Now, the author, for some reason, goes out of its way to share how rich and powerful Xerxes was. Because at the end of the day, at 4 years later, as to when this is recorded, he actually lost a whole lot of kudos, a whole lot of his wealth through a disastrous military campaign that he had to come back with his tail between his legs. However, the author says this king is extremely powerful, extremely rich, because it took 180 days to show everything that he had owned. Wouldn't take me that long, I can assure you. All right. Okay, so now, so during the celebration, when we know the story here in verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs, and he wanted Vashti to come and show herself, and she refused. And this was a terrible affront to the king, because they were all boozed out of their brains, they're all drunk, extremely drunk, but this was how the state was run. They would drink and they would run the state this way. They called Queen Vashti, and in an honour shame culture, it was a terrible thing for Vashti not to come. And in an honour and shame culture, it was her duty to uphold cultural norms. Let us not, with 21st or 20th century eyes, look back into this, of when this was written, like with a feminist perspective or anything like this, and, she was right not to go, rah, rah, rah. But this was a shame on a culture. It was her role to uphold. And so as a result, she effectively now was banished, sacked, and because she did not uphold the cultural norms. Now, as a result, they had to then find a queen to replace her. So, chapter 2, let's pick this one up there. So, after a discussion, and we'll look at verse 2, then the king's young men who attended him, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susha, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them. And so what they did was they had a Miss Universe contest. They got a whole lot of people there from around the entire empire, around about 1,000 young women. And so now it was to beautify them. And so this was the process on which they would do this, and it's quite amazing. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king, and he did so. So let's come down to verse 7. And so he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother, and the young woman had a beautiful figure, and who was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as her own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict was proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susha, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken to the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favour, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and young woman to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known to her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Okay, now I want you to portray the scene. Esther was a Jew who had the fortunate position of being selected as part of the 1,000 people. Now, according to the Bible, they said that she was fairly good looking, wasn't she? And again, the Bible text goes out of its way to talk about her physical good looks. Taken into the harem, and then they was provided with cosmetics, make her look beautiful. And so for the next 12 months, she was prepared to meet the king, and she was to keep her faith quiet. And then she got into this small circle of the king will try you out. Now, I don't want to expand on that, but it's pretty obvious what that means. Now, as a Jew, this is not looking too good, is it? You're becoming a concubine to the Persian world of dressing up, sleeping with a non-Jew, sleeping with him, and denying your faith and eating the king's food, which means that you're eating unclean food. Is that really good practice for a Jew? This is not looking too good for Esther at this point in time, is it? Certainly not. And when you compare that with Daniel chapter 1, what happened in Daniel chapter 1? Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and they all refused, and Daniel all refused what? Oh, the king's food. Why? Well, we are Jews. Big difference, isn't it? Fascinating. And I wonder why she didn't do the same. I wonder why she didn't do the same. Why is it that she felt it okay to eat unclean food, to become a concubine of the then known world, and to sleep with a non-Jew? Moral ambiguity here. All right, let's go down there. Let's pick up verse 14. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shazgaz and the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines, and she would not go into the king again until the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. And so she was down to the small number now. And finally, in verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favour in his sight more than all the other virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then the king gave great feast for all his officials and granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts and royal generosity. So, what a great experience that must have been for her at the time, to be plucked from obscurity and then to become queen. Wow, this is just mind-blowing stuff, isn't it? All right, verse 19. Now when the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and Esther had not made known to her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. And in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, at that place, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, and he came to the knowledge of Mordecai and told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai, and when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Esther becomes queen. As she was becoming queen, she was exceedingly compliant, and it was like a blank page that the Persian Empire wrote on it. And in the process of her becoming queen, they wrote on that page of what she should be, how she should behave, her deportment, her makeup, and everything was about the outside. So when you read the first two chapters, we would say that Esther was not being a very good Adventist, would we? Not quite the children's story that we're quite used to, is it? Now, going back to the problem that we had was that the Jews were in trouble. When the Jews were in trouble, we usually read in the Old Testament on how God delivers them. don't we? Usually intervenes in some sort of grand miracle, a little bit like the 10 plagues or parting of the Red Sea perhaps. But we don't find that here, do we? And so Esther becomes instructive to us in another way, in a way that we are perhaps more accustomed to than the miracle. When I went into ministry, I wanted God to give me a miracle. I wanted the lightning bolt on the tree to zap it in half or something, to say, yep, Mark, this is what I want you to do. Well, the tree didn't break in half from lightning, but I'm here. God leads. And leads in many different ways. And the lady who wrote a commentary, and this is whom I'm relying on, Karen Jobes, she wrote a commentary on Esther, and she recounts a little part of her life story, that she was a computer scientist and she felt God leading her in a number of different ways to her becoming a professor of New Testament, even though she wrote a commentary on Esther. Computer scientist to a professor and a theologian. That's rather a real left field move, isn't it? From that to that. How did that happen? Well, and as she reflected on her life, her reflections have helped her to craft the commentary on Esther. Now, I said to you that there were no miracles in Esther. You might debate with me afterwards, but anyway. There are no miracles as such like in the Gospels. That's where I'm coming from. Prayer is not mentioned. God is not mentioned. Elohim, Yahweh are not mentioned. The law is not mentioned. Why does the author, and if you were to reef Esther out of the Old Testament and just to read it, you would say, that's a fascinating story. Doesn't tell me anything about God at all because God's not mentioned. So you can only read Esther in relation to the Old Testament. So, what's happened here? Why does the author do this? Because he tracks the story of Esther, who starts here, and she says this toward the end of the story. Well, in the middle of the story, sorry. In chapter 4, verse 16. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susha and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days and nights or day. I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, and it is against the law, and that's the law of the land. I'm not talking about the law of the Jews here. And if I perish, I perish. So, what's happened here in chapters 1 or chapter 2, where she was just a blank page where the Persian Empire just wrote their story on her life, she's gone from that, if I perish, I perish. How did that happen without God being mentioned? Really glad you asked that question. You're full of good questions this morning. Now, what had happened in the book of Esther is that there are a number of coincidences that happened in order to turn out this. Like what would have happened if Vashti had not have come to if she did come to the banquet? Well, it would have finished at chapter 1, wouldn't it? Halfway through. We would not have had the rest of the story. What would have happened if Mordecai had not have overheard those people who had a plot against the king? And then what would have happened if the king had have remembered to honour Mordecai at the time instead of later on in the book? Do you understand what I'm saying? But he forgot, and he honoured him later, which allowed the rest of the story to unfold and which allowed Haman's plot to be exposed, that allowed the preservation of the Jews and also Mordecai. What would have happened if? And here's the thing. When it came to the Old Testament and the preservation of the Jews, often God did this in miracles, 10 plagues, the Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea, parting of the Jordan, the slaughtering of the Assyrian army of 180,000, that sort of thing. Gigantic miracles, but here they're not. And it gives us an insight as to how God leads. Now, I don't like the word coincidences, because it could be this, could be that, you know. And this is what people used to say to me when I worked in the post office. How do you know that that's God leading you? How do you know that that was God leading with Esther and leading her there and sleeping with the king and becoming... How do you know that? Esther, the book of Esther is saying that God, who is all-powerful, even though he appears to be absent in the book, is very present in the book. Great news, isn't it? That's the paradox. Even though in our lives we don't have a clue how things are going to turn out, do we? Esther had no clue how things were going to unfold. She was in the middle of the story. We read the end of the story and we read it to the kids and go, kumbaya. Isn't that wonderful? But nobody knew how this was going to work itself out. Mordecai, for reasons we don't know, said, keep your Jewry quiet. Just as well. Well, Daniel and 3 friends didn't, and 1 and 3, did they? So why was it okay then, but not okay here? Or why shouldn't they have done it then in Esther? Why couldn't they remain quiet in Daniel chapter 3 and just bent down and just tied up the shoelaces at the right time? You know what I'm saying? Situational ethics, don't you hate that? Now, don't crucify me on that one, please. But you do have a situation where we just don't know how things work out, do we? And that is the point of Esther. She didn't know. Her life as such didn't appear to include God. It may have done, I don't know. We're not told. And that's the other thing too, is we're not told about their motives, intentions. We're not given any insight into behind the scenes stuff here. It's just told sort of blankly, if you like. So Esther, through a series of events, starts from here and gets to the point where she is able and willing to sacrifice her life. How she got there spiritually, we're not told. But for us, that needs to happen again. Firstly, I want to suggest to you, we need to look at how God leads for a start. and believe that he is leading. There's a whole series of events, coincidences, if you like, and that's what the author is saying, a whole lot of coincidences, but God was working there, does the same in our life. How does it work in our lives? We don't know the end of the story. We believe that God leads us, directs us, looks over us, and we need to trust him. But trust him with the honest intention to follow God each and every day. Not just say, oh, I believe, as we race out the door. But we need to, with the honest intention, to follow God each and every day, believing that he will lead us, guide us, etc. Second thing I want to say to you is we need to be careful that we don't become concubines of the world. We're like fish in the water in a fish tank. We don't realise how much the world in which we live affects and moulds and shapes. It moulded and shaped Esther into the queen. She became a blank page. We need to be careful that we don't allow the world to mould and shape us into its shape. We need to allow the God of the universe to shape and to mould us. And to do that, we need to look up. Worship him each and every day. Ask him to change. Point out what offends. And ask him to mould and shape us. And we need to do that each and every day. Third thing I want to say is that the Queen Esther was a beautiful person. And there was an empire that was set against God's people. And it was moving in a way that it wanted to eradicate the Jews. The Queen, she was a beautiful person who turned out to be the Saviour. Jesus Christ, who is the King of the universe, who was willing to go to the cross and allow his image to be marred to the point where he was bloodied, pierced, had a spear through the side, mocked, and he was willing to do that we might be saved. And here's the striking thing. In Revelation chapter 21 and verse 3, and I want you to just turn that to just for a moment here. Revelation chapter 21 and verse 3. And it says here, I'll just go from verse 2. And I saw a holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God." And that dwelling place is where God wants to dwell, tabernacle, relate, and have that relationship with his people. But here in verse 2, has prepared a bride adorned for her husband. As a bride adorned for her husband. God sees beauty in each one of you here, so much so that he was willing to allow his image to be marred to that extent and to be pierced on the cross that we might live. Is that staggering that God would do that? And the image of the bride that he wants to relate to us that closely, as a bride with her husband, he wants to relate with us that closely. And you see that he would use those terms. And that he sees so much value in humanity. Staggering, isn't it? And when I say humanity, we sometimes think the other person. But he sees so much value in, put your name there. Put your name in it. When you put your name in it, God sees that much value that he was willing to die for you. Maybe God doesn't do huge miracles in our lives, but know that he is working quietly behind the scenes in ways that we don't know for your salvation. And that there's a whole lot of things that are happening that it may appear that God is absent, but he is not. Esther tells us that God is working there behind the scenes actively. Isn't that great news? So that you can share in the great banquet. Vashti had the banquet that was pretty spectacular. But God has another banquet with your name tag there. Isn't that good news?